In 1950, the US military secretly carried out a biological warfare experiment over an American city. The people living there had no idea it was happening. Families went to work, children walked to school. Fog moved through the streets of San Francisco, and above the city, invisible particles drifted through the air. The military believed the experiment was necessary for national security during the Cold War. But decades later, many Americans would look back at the operation and ask the same question. How far should a government go in the name of defense? This was Operation Sea Spray, one of the most controversial military experiments ever conducted on American soil. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the fear America was living through in 1950. World War II had ended only a few years earlier, but peace did not last long. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was growing rapidly. The Korean War had just begun. Nuclear weapons were changing military strategy, and American officials feared future attacks involving biological warfare. Military planners wanted answers to urgent questions. If an enemy released biological agents over a major US city, how far would the particles spread? How vulnerable were American cities? How quickly could contamination move through crowded urban environments? Laboratory testing was not enough. The military wanted real-world data, and eventually they chose San Francisco. The city's geography made it useful for the experiment. The fog, wind patterns, and dense urban environment allowed researchers to study how airborne particles moved through a populated area. But there was one major problem. The public was never informed. From September 20 to September 27, 1950, the US Navy secretly released bacteria into the air near San Francisco as part of a classified military operation. The bacteria used were called Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi. At the time, military researchers believed these bacteria were relatively harmless. They were used as stand-ins to simulate how dangerous biological agents might spread through a city. The operation was carried out from a Navy ship positioned off the California coast. As the ship released particles into the air, monitoring stations across San Francisco tracked how the material moved through the city. The military expected the experiment to produce useful information, but the results shocked researchers. Reports later suggested that nearly all of San Francisco's roughly 800,000 residents may have inhaled thousands of particles during the operation. In simple words, one of America's largest cities had unknowingly become part of a secret military test. At the time, military officials considered the operation successful. The particles spread efficiently. San Francisco appeared highly vulnerable to a potential biological attack. To Cold War planners, that information was valuable. But the public was never supposed to know, and this is where the story became controversial. Weeks after the spraying, doctors at Stanford Hospital noticed something unusual. Several patients had developed rare infections involving Serratia marcescens. One patient, Edward J. Nevin, later died after developing a serious infection following surgery. Over time, questions began to grow. Could the military experiment have contributed to illnesses in the city? The answer has remained debated for decades. Some experts argued there was not enough evidence directly linking the experiment to Nevin's death, because the patients had already undergone medical procedures that may have increased their risk of infection. Courts later ruled that the evidence was insufficient to prove the government caused his death. But the controversy never disappeared, because even if the bacteria were believed to be harmless at the time, the public had never agreed to become part of the experiment. That became one of the biggest ethical questions surrounding Operation Sea Spray. Did the government have the right to secretly test biological agents over civilians without their knowledge? And San Francisco was not the only place where this happened. Years later, Senate hearings revealed a much larger story. For decades, most Americans had no idea these experiments existed. Then, in 1977, Senate investigations exposed a shocking truth. The US military had conducted hundreds of open-air biological tests across America between the late 1940s and the 1960s. Some experiments involved releasing supposedly harmless bacteria in cities, airports, subway systems, and public spaces. One famous test in New York involved dropping light bulbs filled with bacteria into the subway system to study how particles spread through tunnels and train cars. To many Americans, the revelations were deeply unsettling. Ordinary citizens had unknowingly become part of Cold War military research, and most had never been informed. The story damaged public trust, especially because the experiments happened during a time when fear of communism and national security often overpowered concerns about transparency. But supporters of the military's actions argued something different. They claimed the experiments reflected the mindset of the Cold War. Officials believed biological warfare was a real threat, and researchers thought the bacteria being used were safe based on what was known at the time. To them, the tests were meant to prepare the country for future attacks. That debate still exists today. Was Operation Sea Spray a necessary Cold War defense experiment? Or was it an unethical violation of public trust? What makes the story so unsettling is not only the experiment itself, it is how normal everything looked while it was happening. People in San Francisco went about their daily routines without knowing they were part of a military test. Workers walked through the streets, children played outside, families opened windows to the cool city air, and above them, invisible particles drifted through the fog. The public knew nothing. That is what makes Operation Sea Spray feel disturbing even decades later, because it reminds people how much governments can do in secret during moments of fear and national tension. And it raises questions that still matter today. How much secrecy should governments have during national security crises? When does defense preparation go too far? And how much risk should ordinary citizens unknowingly face in the name of military research? Today, Operation Sea Spray is remembered as one of the most controversial Cold War experiments conducted on American soil, not because it caused mass destruction, but because it exposed uncomfortable questions about secrecy, public trust, and the limits of government power during times of fear. Most people living in San Francisco in 1950 never realized they had become part of a secret military experiment. They never saw the Navy ship releasing bacteria offshore. They never knew monitoring stations were tracking the spread across the city. And they never imagined that decades later, historians, journalists, and Senate investigators would still be debating what happened that week. Operation Sea Spray was not a conspiracy theory. It was real. A secret military operation carried out during one of the most fearful periods in American history. And for many Americans, it became a warning about what can happen when national security operates without public knowledge or consent. So the next time someone says history is only about wars and presidents, remember this. In 1950, a major American city was unknowingly used in a secret Cold War biological warfare experiment. The public was never informed. The operation stayed hidden for years, and decades later, Americans were still asking whether the experiment had gone too far. If you want more hidden American history they never taught in school, subscribe for the next story.